Just 6 weeks, the United States is estimated to have lost over $9.3 billion in agricultural orders simply because the world no longer wants to buy from America. 5 of the country's largest trade partners simultaneously shifted all their orders to a name once considered merely a side player in global agriculture, Canada. While American farmers watch soybeans pile up and beef go unsold, Canada saw its food exports surge by 37% in May and June of 2025, alone a growth rate unseen in the past 2 decades. What's really going on? Let's take a closer look in today's video. Canada's food exports surge as 5 major U.S. trade partners withdraw, because the withdrawal of these 5 partners could affect your meals and your job. Please note that the information presented here is compiled from statistical data and is not intended to discredit any organization or individual. Number 1. 5 G7 countries. No one expected the first partners to pull away would be those called allies. Not emerging economies, not volatile markets, but the 5 remaining countries in the G7: Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy. These nations once stood alongside the United States in the most strategic agreements of the last century. Now they are quietly shifting away from the trade table, with Washington leaning instead toward Ottawa. In 2023 alone, U.S. agricultural exports to these 5 countries reached over $74 billion, equivalent to nearly a quarter of the industry's total value. Orders from Europe and Japan were not just sources of revenue, but also lifelines for key farming states: Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Illinois, Wisconsin, where millions of households rely on farming storage and domestic transport. But by June 2025, the trade map began to pivot. At the G7 summit, the world waited for collective progress on supply chain security. Instead, what drew the most attention was absence. When the US president left the summit, early trade negotiations fell silent, and the remaining leaders began seeking their own paths. A series of closed-door meetings took place between Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and his European and Japanese counterparts. The main topic wasn't climate or defense, but food. Food which is becoming more expensive and increasingly fragile within the global supply chain. And while the US is viewed as unstable due to domestic political upheaval, Canada is emerging as a calm, reliable, and predictable supplier. Preliminary data from Statistics Canada shows that in June 2025, alone, Canadian food exports to G7 members rose nearly 20%. Each country had its own reasons, but the trend was clear to find a stable supply source less entangled in political shifts. Japan expanded orders for Canadian beef and wheat, while Germany and France signed dairy and grain import contracts lasting through the end of 2026. The United Kingdom, once a major soybean market for the US, has shifted over 40% of its orders to farms in Alberta and Saskatchewan. For the US, this isn't just a statistical drop. It's a domino effect now visible across the Midwest. Corn prices in Iowa have fallen to their lowest levels in nearly a decade, while soybean stockpiles in Kansas have grown so large that local governments have had to temporarily subsidize storage. A June report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture noted that combined corn and soybean inventory had exceeded 52 million tons, an unusually high figure not seen since 2013. And the next harvest season is fast approaching. Several agricultural banks across the Corn Belt, such as in Nebraska, have suspended new credit for small and medium-sized farms, citing a lack of guaranteed output markets. Production expansion loans are on hold. Cold storage and packaging facility projects, once hoping for European-funded contracts, are now frozen indefinitely. Meanwhile, the federal government continues to struggle with budget issues as a tax relief package for farmers nears expiration. According to the American Farm Bureau Federation, if not renewed, U.S. farmers may face tens of billions of dollars in additional taxes over the next 18 months, just as they are losing their biggest customers. This is no longer just a trade crisis, it's a crisis of confidence from international buyers and from the American public itself. You may have once believed that America was the breadbasket of the world, the destination for every ship when the world needed food. But when you turn on the TV today, that image is no longer there. You see Canadian food arriving at the port of Rotterdam. You see beef containers from Alberta lining up in Tokyo. You hear that milk and grain orders from Saskatchewan are replacing supplies from Iowa, Illinois, and Kansas. And if you live up north in some quiet province of Canada, you're also feeling the shift. Not through fanfare or slogans, but through the sound of harvesters running later each day, through neighbors expanding their storage, through the sense that something big is coming, though no one has yet named it. A rare opportunity is arriving, not because you've beaten someone, but because you're still here when others have left. In Q2 of 2025, according to Bloomberg intelligence estimates, the U.S. is projected to have lost nearly $6 billion in agricultural export value compared to the same period last year. Meanwhile, Canada grew nearly 13%, largely due to new contracts with G7 partners. Contracts that should have gone to the U.S. orders that should have docked in New Orleans but are now headed for Halifax. If you ever thought longtime partners would always stay, then now is the time to ask if even Japan, Germany, and the UK have turned away. Who will still stand with America? The answer may be forming at the southern border, where a country once considered the oldest friend is quietly shifting its orders not north to the US, but further north still. Mexico, our closest neighbor, may also be reconsidering. Number 2, Mexico. Both neighbors are shaking hands while the one in the middle is being left out. That is the current relationship between the US, Canada, and Mexico. Canada in the north, Mexico in the south. Both once depended on the US. But by June 2025, they joined forces while America, standing in between, became the odd one out. In economic stories, the most painful thing is not loss, but losing relationships once thought irreplaceable. For American farmers, Mexico used to be one of those relationships. A stable, close, familiar partner. Corn trucks from Iowa, beef from Texas, soybeans from Nebraska cross the southern border daily as naturally as breathing. In 2024, the U.S. exported more than $31 billion worth of agricultural goods to Mexico, a record that made Mexico the largest market for U.S. agriculture. And it was precisely because of this closeness that Mexico's turn away in 2025 came as not just a surprise, but a bitter one. It started with small signals, longer customs clearance times, some major contracts, paused negotiations, delayed without clear reason. But things became more apparent when the U.S. government tightened the border, ramped up immigration enforcement, and used trade policy as leverage.
All right, fear and uncertainty are spreading through many parts of Southern California.
Yes, reports and videos of ICE agents spotted near factories and in warehouses. They have many workers choosing not to show up.
These measures not only affected migrant labor, but slowed the entire logistics chain serving agricultural exports. Mexico realized that as long as they remained dependent on American farm products, every unstable policy from Washington was a ticking time bomb in their food system, and the partner they turned to was none other than Canada. Not far away, not risky, and importantly, not politically conditional. From April 2025, Canadian delegations began quietly appearing in Mexico City. By mid-June, a trade agreement worth over $5 billion between Mexico and Canada was signed, focusing on soybeans, frozen meat, wheat, and processed dairy, precisely the product groups once deeply tied to American farmers. Soon after, food containers from Canada began arriving at the port of Veracruz. And U.S. containers still waiting in warehouses with no one to unload them, still stuck at checkpoints due to paperwork issues, still without a delivery schedule because Mexico is shifting supply sources. According to estimates from CoBank in Q2 of 2025, U.S. agricultural exports to Mexico dropped nearly 18%. Meanwhile, exports from Canada to Mexico surged 16%, the highest increase in over a decade. In trade, two lines crossing like that say a great deal. In southern states, Texas, Arizona, and traditional farming regions like Iowa and Nebraska, the mood has noticeably dimmed. Refrigerated trucks that once ran through the night now sit idle in lots all day. Silos full of corn and soybeans can't move product because old contracts are suspended and new ones have yet to appear. Banks are requiring proof of output before approving seasonal credit. But farmers know well when your biggest customer just changed suppliers, there's no proof you can show. And what unsettles them most is the feeling of being pushed out by the very two neighbors they once trusted most. Canada used to be a major partner but distant emotionally. Mexico was right next door, visible within reach, sharing a border consumption habits harvest seasons. Yet now the two are doing business together while Americans only hear about it through reports and the media. At major Mexican import firms, the decision to pivot wasn't driven by resentment but by trade logic. They no longer wanted to be affected by internal U.S. disputes, from budgets to elections, from farm taxes to labor policies. To them, no one dares sign a 3-year contract with a country that might change its policies in 3 months. Within Mexico's food sector, the phrase reducción de riesgo, risk reduction, has become a guiding principle. And Canada, a country without a border, but with a history of never surprising anyone in trade, has become the more valuable partner. Meanwhile, the U.S. remains confused. The government is preoccupied with political crises, while the Department of Agriculture can only issue warnings in internal reports. Farm associations send letters and propose financial support measures, but those cries for help amid global headlines about the Middle East, Ukraine, or domestic inflation seem to go unheard. And something more alarming is happening. It's not just Mexico doing this. Farther east, a major industrial economy in Asia, once tightly linked to U.S. agriculture, is also growing uneasy. For them, stability isn't just a requirement, it's a survival strategy. And if the Canadians can offer that, they are ready to switch too. And when two longtime friends begin pulling back, perhaps it's time for America to ask itself, what is making our closest relationships walk away? And is there anyone left with enough patience to wait for the US to return to the table? Number 3, South Korea. South Korea still trusts the US on technology, but turns away when it comes to food. Why has trust been split like this? In the relationship between the US and South Korea, technology and defense have always been the two pillars most often mentioned. But few people notice that over the past 2 decades, South Korea has also been one of the most stable and important markets for American agriculture. In 2024, the US exported more than $7.8 billion worth of agricultural products to South Korea, a significant number spread across key commodities such as soybeans, corn pork, and beef. Many farms in the American Midwest even design production processes specifically to meet South Korean standards because they know this is a market willing to pay a premium for quality and safety. However, by 2025, that atmosphere began to change, and the turning point didn't come from farmers, but from the mindset of policymakers in Seoul. When global trade disputes intensified early in the year and tariff proposals were introduced by the US as part of domestic policy adjustments, the South Korean government was forced to consider the worst-case scenario that food supplies could be disrupted. According to data from the Korea Times, the Korean Ministry of Agriculture had once activated a 90-day plan, a contingency in case exports from the US were halted or delayed due to policy instability. This was no longer a routine precaution, but a shift in strategic orientation, and at that moment Canada appeared. Quietly, without pressure, Canadian trade delegations approached South Korea with a simple yet effective offer: stable supply, competitive prices, and no political risk attached. By June, the two sides had signed a series of contracts worth more than $560 million, mainly grains, processed dairy, and frozen meat, extending to 2029. According to Bloomberg, estimates the total order value may increase as major supermarket chains in Seoul begin prioritizing the Product of Canada label. This shift didn't make media headlines, but in the logistics and export industry, everyone knows it was a silent earthquake. The port of Busan, once a familiar destination for American agricultural containers, now sees more and more maple leaf flags, according to data from statistics. Canadian agricultural exports to South Korea increased by 14% in the second quarter of 2025, the strongest rise since 2011. Meanwhile, in the US, the USDA recorded a decline of over $1.2 billion in the Northeast Asia market segment during the same period, most of it from South Korea. You don't have to look far to see the consequences. In states like Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska, places that once considered South Korea the most reliable international outlet, hundreds of farms are now forced to adjust their production plans. Local banks have temporarily suspended approvals for new seasonal credit due to rising export risks. Warehouses along the Mississippi River have grown quiet. The logistics chain linking the Midwest to the Port of New Orleans is beginning to contract. And what saddens many farmers more than the loss of orders is the sense of falling into uncertainty. They had invested in equipment inspections and barn systems built to the standards required by South Korea. They had upheld quality commitments for years, but all of that wasn't enough to hold on to a customer if trust in policy is no longer there. South Korea didn't say much, but domestic trade experts understood clearly this was a way to break down risk. They still cooperate with the US on technology, but no longer want to place their entire food security in the hands of a country whose policy changes they cannot control. Canada, on the other hand, is exactly what South Korea is looking for: a quiet, steady supplier, free of internal disputes with no midterm policy shifts. For South Korea, that is enough to realign their long-term supply chain. A heavy silence spread across rural America as this news circulated. Calls from logistics firms canceling contracts, emails from importers requesting shipment suspensions. Some South Korean food companies have reduced the share of American goods in new contracts by 25 to 30%, according to internal data from the International Food Inspection Standards Organization, IFAS. This situation also reveals a paradox. the US remains one of the world's top producers of high-quality agricultural goods. But in today's market, quality alone is no longer enough to keep customers. Many older American farmers once considered South Korea one of the last markets that wouldn't walk away even during the pandemic. But now that this market too is shifting, they can't help but feel uneasy what is happening to America's position on the global agricultural trade map. This is not just an immediate loss. It is a long-term warning that if uncertainty keeps repeating, even the closest markets can turn away, not out of anger, but simply because they cannot accept the risk. And South Korea, with its tradition of caution, may just be the first to move. Number 4, the Netherlands. If there's one place considered the gateway for American agricultural products to enter the European market, it is the Netherlands. With the port of Rotterdam the largest logistics hub in Europe and a transport network spanning the continent, this small country has long served as a global transit station for food and agriculture. For decades, millions of tons of grain, soybeans, beef, and pork from the US have been brought here before spreading throughout Western Europe. Farmers in Iowa and Illinois often joke, to get into Europe you have to go through the Netherlands first. But in early 2025, that route began to shift quietly and without warning. Statistics from Eurostat and the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture show a clear shift. Imports of US agricultural goods through Rotterdam dropped by more than 25% compared to the same period last year. Meanwhile, goods from Canada rose nearly 22%. Changes that seem technical, such as SPS procedures, customs clearance times, and quarantine standards, became the deciding factors in who gets to proceed. This doesn't mean the Netherlands has turned its back. It simply means they are responding appropriately in their role as an efficient logistics hub, prioritizing those who deliver on schedule with fewer risks and greater consistency. And Canada, with the CETA agreement and years of steady agricultural policies, arrived at the right time. The consequences, of course, are not limited to Europe. In the US, the transportation system from the Midwest to the Port of New Orleans was designed to serve the Rotterdam route. When goods can't dock on time, storage facilities in Illinois, Ohio, and Missouri begin to overflow. USDA data shows soybean and corn inventories rose more than 26% in the second quarter. Many warehouses were forced to suspend intake. Some rural banks paused short-term credit disbursements due to rising export market risks. According to analysis by CoBank and Bloomberg Agriculture, the mere loss of transshipment capacity in Rotterdam could cost the U.S. between $1.1 and $1.4 billion in agricultural export revenue in Q2 2025, mainly from products like corn, soybeans, and processed meats. But the impact isn't just about numbers. When the destination port changes, the entire domestic logistics chain in the U.S. feels the ripple effect. The river transport route from the Midwest down the Mississippi to New Orleans began to sharply reduce frequency, forcing many barge operators to cut hours or suspend services. Trucking companies that handled the final leg from warehouses to port saw orders dropped 30-40% in the past 3 months. Some soybean processing plants in Illinois and Missouri, established solely to serve the European market, began reducing capacity, pushing hundreds of workers into unpaid leave. The atmosphere in agricultural towns suddenly turned heavy. Areas once tied to European exports began to wonder, was that dream too beautiful? And if there's no route closer than Rotterdam, where's that dream heading? Older Midwesterners who lived through a time when a single EU export contract could save an entire season now only see containers bearing the Canadian flag being unloaded in the Netherlands, while American goods remain on the West Coast awaiting clearance. No one says clearly what is happening, but everyone senses something is slipping away slowly but surely. Meanwhile, in Canada, the picture is entirely different. Statistics Canada reported that shipments from Halifax and Vancouver to Europe rose 19% in Q2. Canadian farmers gained access to preferential credit, expanded cold storage networks, and packaging plants to meet the sudden surge in demand. International logistics companies began prioritizing direct container routes from Canada to Rotterdam, something rarely seen before. The question isn't who won, but who prepared better. The US has good products, but Canada has clear routes. The US has a long trade history, but Canada has the right agreements. And in an era where reliability is the top criterion, a small delay in customs can put an entire export system at a long-term disadvantage. For Americans, especially those who once saw Rotterdam as a foothold into Europe, this is not just about losing a market, but losing a piece of hope, losing an export corridor once considered unchangeable. And without the Dutch port as a launchpad, many are beginning to reevaluate their country's trade policy, not to criticize, but to find answers. What can we do when the world is quietly shifting direction without waiting for us to adapt Rotterdam, once the starting point for the US? Agricultural export chain to the old continent is now opening its doors to other flags. No one is closing the door on America, but no one is waiting for America to get ready either. And the most worrying part is this doesn't stop at the Netherlands, because there is still one final name left to place once known for being a stable long-term anchor that is now also beginning to look in another direction. We will now arrive at the final name on today's list. Number 5, Indonesia. In just one morning at the end of May, 4 shipments of American soybeans destined for the port of Jakarta were rerouted not due to weather or technical issues, but because of a decision by Indonesia. Buyers turned to Canadian suppliers for a simple reason: faster, more stable, and less risky. To many Americans, Indonesia may seem distant, but for farms in the Midwest, this country once carried hope a growing market, populace, and eating more. As the European market became increasingly uncertain, Southeast Asia emerged as a new gateway, and within that gateway, Indonesia was the main frame. According to data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 2024, agricultural exports to Indonesia reached over $4.2 billion, mostly soybeans, dried corn, frozen beef, and powdered milk. Many farms had retooled production lines to meet halal standards, and some signed long-term contracts to build storage facilities near West Coast ports. But by early 2025, the winds shifted. At an economic forum in Bali, Canada, and Indonesia quietly signed a series of cooperation agreements lasting until 2030, focusing on agriculture logistics and the food supply chain. The content was not just simple buying and selling. It was a long-term strategy with cold storage centers, preservation stations, and priority transport routes reserved for Canadian goods. The Indonesian government stated they chose Ottawa for its reliability and long-term commitment, while American goods faced many policy hurdles. Unlike losses suffered in the G7 or Mexico, longtime partners, Indonesia's pivot created a different kind of bitterness: the loss of a future. Not the loss of an old acquaintance, but the dropping of a new opportunity right before one's eyes. For the younger generation of American farmers who had placed hopes in ASEAN as an escape from dependence on traditional markets, this was a slip no one had time to catch. The impact on the domestic market is clear. According to CoBank estimates in Q2 2025, the US may have lost $700 million in export revenue to Indonesia, but the truly worrying number lies in the future if the trend spreads across ASEAN. Total losses could exceed $4 billion annually. That figure isn't found on the Chicago Exchange, but in every field, every farm, every community that lives by cultivation. What's especially concerning is the ripple effect. Indonesia is not an isolated nation. It is a consumption hub, a gateway to ASEAN. When it changes import directions, distributors in Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand also begin recalculating, and on Canada's side, the preparation started early. According to data from Statistics Canada, container volumes from Vancouver and Halifax to the ports of Jakarta, Surabaya, and Belawan increased nearly 23% in just 3 months. Cold storage systems were expanded. Agricultural cooperatives in Saskatchewan and Alberta received funding support to boost output. Meanwhile, the US had yet to send any high-level trade envoy to Jakarta since the start of the year, a vacuum that Indonesians did not wait to fill. For Americans living in the Midwest, this goes far beyond trade. It's a matter of livelihood. One-road towns where 80% of income comes from a major export contract are slowly falling silent. Banks are more cautious with seasonal loans. Grain storage piles up with no place to go. Some processing facilities have to rotate workers on furlough. Canada didn't just win a contract. They're gradually turning Indonesia into their own agricultural distribution center for all of ASEAN. With the CPTPP agreement as a foundation and a supply chain carefully invested in, they are building a structure that the US will struggle to enter even if it wants to return. And when consumers grow accustomed to the packaging brands and standards of another country, the path back is not only slow, but costly. At the macro level, this raises a question with no clear answer. If the US cannot maintain its leadership in the food supply chain of Southeast Asia, a region once considered a 21st century priority, then who will? And by the time we realize that, will it already be too late? Indonesia didn't turn away with declarations, but with action. No noise, no criticism, but decisively. They chose partners not for loud voices, but for trustworthiness. And if a market once seen as emerging, tua partes baris Easy to Axis is the first to pivot, then perhaps America needs to reassess its entire trade strategy. For farmers who've invested both capital and hope into the Southeast Asian market, this is a tough pill to swallow. But they continue to work, continue planting, continue harvesting, because they were never the problem. The question is, who is making decisions on their behalf, and is anyone still listening?